like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong in my happy place. I got my head held high, I'm on my way, and I'm following the signs to my happy place. I'm walking in the light of a brand new day, and I'm right where I belong in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong in my happy place. And I'm right where I belong in my happy place.
Welcome to the National University of Singapore Yong Loo School of Medicine Healthy Longevity webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. We will talk about patience, not patient, but patience and longevity. Professor Uwe Sunde is our guest. And after my first very inspiring discussion with Professor Sunde, it was in London, I had lots of questions, and I expect that you will have even more. So please use the Q&A function. We start today's webinar with a short presentation by Casey Yeh, our PhD student at the Center for Healthy Longevity, and she will talk about an important topic, and that is dietary pattern and their association with cognitive function in Singapore older adults.
Hello, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Casey, and I'm a graduate student in the Center for Healthy Longevity. In this short talk, I'm going to share with you my research topic on the dietary pattern associated with reduced risk of cognitive impairment in Singaporean older adults. As we all know, cognitive function declines with age, but not all cognitive decline is considered normal. In a condition called dementia, the features of cognitive decline becomes amplified. Rather than simply forgetting that a meeting was on, someone with dementia might not remember the meeting was ever planned. Other than memory loss, dementia patients also experience various other symptoms, such as difficulty performing familiar tasks, problems with language, disorientation to time and place, poor or decreased judgment, problem keeping track of things, and eventually they start to withdraw from work or social activities. These symptoms gradually worsen over a number of years. As the patients become aware of this loss of control, they may become depressed, fearful, and irritable. Why should we care about dementia in Singapore? It is estimated that by 2030, the proportion of residents aged 65 and above is to 1 in 5 residents in Singapore. Given that age is a big risk factor for dementia, there is likely going to be a rise in the number of cases of dementia in the near future. According to the statistics in 2018, dementia affects 1 in 10 Singaporeans aged 60 and above, and 1 in 2 for those aged 85 and above. This creates a burden to the economy, as in 2018, dementia has cost the economy over $1 trillion, and this figure is expected to double by 2030. Dementia is also a burden to patients, carers, and families. Dementia limits individuals' ability to live, socialize, and identify and satisfy needs. The same reduction in quality of life is experienced by the family members, as many studies show that families are forced to cut back on expenditures in order to support a loved one with dementia. There is currently no drug therapies that can reverse the disease progression of dementia. As a result, the focus has been placed on preventive strategies that can delay or slow onset of the disease, including the proactive management of modifiable risk factors such as diet. A healthy diet is fundamental to healthy living. Studies have shown that diet not only directly impacts on cognitive function, but also indirectly through controlling risk for chronic diseases such as hypertension and type 2 diabetes, which are themselves risk factors for dementia. Diets that have been found to have beneficial effects on cognitive health include the Mediterranean diet, the dietary approach to stop hypertension, or known as the DASH diet, and the MIND diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. All these dietary patterns emphasizes on the eating of green leafy vegetables, fruits, in particular berries, whole grains, nuts, legumes, healthy fats such as olive oil and fish. However, all these dietary patterns are derived from the Western countries, and limited studies have looked at the role of diet in cognitive health in Asians whose eating habits are very different from the counterparts in the West. As a result, the aim of my study is to identify a diet specific to the local Singaporean population that is associated with reduced risk of cognitive impairment. By using dietary information from more than 700 local Singaporean older adults, I obtained the following dietary pattern that was associated with reduced risk of cognitive impairment. So this dietary pattern is featured by greater intakes of green leafy vegetables, red-orange vegetables, whole grains, tofu, nuts, and legumes, while limiting the intakes of chocolate, biscuit, pastries, sweets, coffee, poultry with skin, butter, malt beverages, roti, fast food, sugar, and some of the local sweets. Many of these items are similar to what have been suggested by the predefined diet, while some, such as tofu, roti, kueh, and Indian sweets, are unique to the Singaporean diets. So moving forward, we'll continue to see if the locally defined diet is associated with reduced inflammation in the body, and moreover, comparison of the newly defined diet will be made with the predefined diet in terms of cognitive impairment risk reduction. Overall, the current study has the merit of relevance to the Singaporean population, and the findings will help inform about the best dietary strategies for prevention of cognitive impairment and dementia in Singapore. Hopefully, this will all help us to live not only longer, but also healthier and happier lives. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Casey, for this great opportunity to hear about also coffee. I think that will not be, I might not able to reduce that, but I think it's great to hear that dietary interventions might not only delay the cognitive decline, but also increase the health span. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Uwe Sunde, and he is a full professor of economics at the University of Munich in Germany, where he holds the chair of population economics. He studied economics, of course, in the UK and Germany, and obtained his PhD from the University of Bonn, also in Germany. Before joining the University of Munich, he held the chair of macroeconomics at the University of St. Gallen. And Uwe has made theoretical and empirical contributions in the field of economic growth, long-run development, population economics, economic demography, etc., etc. So today, he is talking about behavior and talking about longevity and patience. Uwe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me share my screen because I brought a few slides. Okay, so thanks a lot for the invitation to be with you tonight, and thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to talk about a topic that I think is very important, longevity and patience, or maybe more generally, the connection between preferences or economic preferences and age. And what do I mean by economic preferences, and why do I actually talk about patience? Well, as economists, we typically model behavior, and behavior are decisions that we take every day, and all the behavior that we observe, be it buying candy bars, be it buying sneakers or cars, essentially are broken down to three basic elements for decision making, and that's preferences, the budget, the constraints, and information. And if you think about buying candy bars, for instance, or sneakers, then, well, holding constant your budget and holding constant your information about prices and about what type of sneakers or cars are available, you might want to buy one or the other. And this is what we determine, or what we call as preference. Now, in terms of preferences, there's nothing really fundamental about it in the sense of, we all have it, and we all assume that people are endowed with preferences. But as economists, of course, it is very difficult to differentiate between completely different decisions like candy bar purchases or sneakers or cars. And that's why as economists, we typically try to standardize to be able to bring things into models. And these models consist of these primitives, preferences, but then we try to break them down into classes that are relevant for certain decisions. And patience is the economic preference when you talk about intertemporal choice. So choices that require you to give up something today in order to get something more in the future. Now, this sounds very abstract, but it's very easy to think about these preferences. It's also very easy to measure them. If I ask you, for instance, would you be willing to take on an offer? I give you $100 now, or I give you $150 in 1 year from now. And I ask you, make a choice. Many of you would probably make the choice, yeah, I wait, I take $150. Then I might ask you, okay, so what about an alternative choice? I ask you $100 now or $105 in 1 year from now. Then you might say, well, you know, $5 is not a lot. Let me take the 100 now. And then I might repeat this titration to get into a point where you're actually indifferent. And this point of indifference represents your rate of time preference or your patience in terms of an internal rate of return that you require to wait for 1 year. And the way I presented it is a very standardized way of eliciting these preferences. Once I've elicited that preference, I can make the assumption that, you know, time preference is something that pertains to many decisions that are intertemporal, so maybe also about health behavior and so on. But of course, any intertemporal decision will require us to think about patience. By the way, there is no wrong or right in these questions, and there's lots of heterogeneity. This is actually what we try to measure and find out about, but we respect that. There is nothing wrong or right about being more impatient or less impatient. This is how we are. We are all different. The same goes in other domains, risk preferences, for instance. I might offer you lotteries to gamble between, say, a lottery, I don't know, I pay you $1,000 or nothing with probability 1/2 each. And I offer you an alternative choice, which is a safe payment of, say, $400. Which would you choose? And then a similar iteration process could bring me to the point where you are actually indifferent between taking a risky choice, a lottery, and a safe payment. That would be a measure of your risk preference. And there are many other contexts for economists. These are the two most important, presumably, time preference and risk preference, but there are many other domains that we could think about in terms of preferences. Social preferences, are people altruistic, reciprocal, and how are they? Personality traits that many psychologists have studied, for instance, the famous Big Five, I'm going to talk about them later on, and also political preferences for institutions, for policies, for parties. So this is what essentially I try to talk about today. And in economics, we usually assume that preferences are stable for methodological reasons, because that allows us to avoid tautological statements. But of course, we might argue, is that really true? And if we look at preference measures, they are not really stable over time. So once you start eliciting, and that is what I'm going to show you, time preference and risk preferences, you would see that people differ and they change over time. Now, that is the point where actually the topic of this talk comes in. So healthy longevity or aging. So how does age change preferences? You could think about several ways. Maybe this is just a mechanical change. You know, older people are different from younger people, but that's maybe not a very good explanation. Maybe there are particular mechanisms that change preferences. For instance, changes in levels of hormone production, other physiological aspects that might affect the willingness to take risks or the patience that people have, and so on. Or it could be other things. Older people have experienced different environments, have made other experiences than younger people. And there is lots of evidence that, for instance, having contracted a disease or having had severe surgery or having had a car accident changes people's behavior towards risk and their risk preferences. So there are many things that might come up with in terms of stability. What I'm going to be interested in talking about today is age. So I will talk a bit about age profiles, and then I'm going to talk a lot about the difficulties in measuring age profiles, confounders, age and longevity, and I'm going to end talking a bit about heterogeneity. So how would you think about age? And maybe having talked about patients, maybe you have already formed a belief about your own patients. And then I could ask you, what would you expect in terms of an age profile for patients? What would you need for that? What would I have to show you? Well, I would have to show you data that have been elicited in a similar way as I described before, using validated measures in surveys or in lab experiments. And then I could, for a group of people, a representative sample, show you what are the age profiles. So what is the patient's or risk preference for people at different ages? And this is what we have done using a newly developed survey module that then was brought out in 76 countries all over the world. And what you see here is an age profile of patients, so of the willingness to take the $100 now rather than in 1 year from now, measured in a standardized way across people from 76 countries. Around 80,000 respondents are behind this picture. And what I've done here is I've normalized the patients for people at age 40. And what you see is that, well, there's a relatively stable age pattern before the age of 40, maybe 50, but after 50, in the early 60s, 70s, people start becoming less and less patient. That is what we find here. So I'm not going to go through the quantitative interpretation, but the qualitative pattern is this one. Now, this might, of course, hide a lot of heterogeneity. If you split this up into men and women, you see, well, men and women actually differ in terms of their time preferences, but the age profiles are very, very similar. They are very comparable. What about risk preferences? Since I introduced the lottery before, this would be the comparable age pattern for risk preferences. And here we see a slightly different pattern. Risk preferences seem to fall throughout the full age range. So younger people are more willing to take risks than older people. Older people seem to be more risk averse. Again, the gender differences are not very pronounced as far as the age profile is concerned. There are level differences, and I should have said, so when I show you these pictures, what we've taken out is systematic variation in preferences across countries, for instance. So this is already corrected for. So I'm really showing you just the plain age profile, correcting for nuisance parameters and other factors. But then, thinking about these figures, you might ask yourself, well, is that really age? So, or could it be something else? What could we think about as the drivers? Well, as I said before, age might represent chronological or metabolical aspects of life that change in the body, in the metabolism, in hormone production, and so on. But when we compare the people at different ages, we are comparing, well, very complicated heterogeneities. Well, and for those of you who have ever had anything to do with demography, of course, the first things that come to mind are, well, if I measure people at different points in their life, they have been exposed to different environments. Maybe I even measure them at different points in time, and maybe the environment is reflected in these responses. And if I compare people of different ages, it's very hard to disentangle plain age effects from cohort differences. Well, if I compare people that, like me, who belong to the generation X, maybe my risk preferences are different from those of millennials because I'm older. But maybe it's also because I'm a member of generation X and because I'm not a millennial. And millennials grew up in a completely different environment than I did. They made different experiences in life. So this is a very hard problem. And when we want to talk about age profiles, we should in principle be able to differentiate, to disentangle period cohort effects from age effects. And this is a very hard problem that is, that has plagued demographers and of course also medical scientists for generations, I would say. This is the problem of multicollinearity, because if I compare two people, a 20-year-old and a 40-year-old, they might be, they differ in age by 20 years. They also differ in terms of their birth years, because the 40-year-old was born 20 years before the 20-year-old. And then, I cannot disentangle all three dimensions because they're perfectly collinear in a panel data setting where I start comparing these people over time. Because there are always two things moving at the same time. If I compare them at different points in time, well, I'm going to keep the age and the cohort differences constant. If I compare people of different ages at different points in time, still there's the cohort problem and so on, which raises the problem of identification and homogeneity. If you deal with that, there are different approaches that I don't have much time to go into detail, but effectively what turns out is that you need repeated observations for individuals or groups of individuals that belong to the same age and birth cohort. And there you will have to make some assumptions about one of these dimensions, for instance, period effects, because of the necessity of breaking this multicollinearity, of getting to some nonlinear variation. We did that in a paper in 2017 that I'm going to show you in a second. There is also a question of homogeneity, because once you start thinking about age profiles and cohort differences and period differences in preferences, of course, another question arises, namely, are these age profiles comparable across cohorts, or is there even heterogeneity, that age profiles of Generation X members like me differ from the age profiles of millennials? So are there homogeneous age effects, and does that pertain to the full age range? Also, in recent work with co-authors, we have considered that, and I'm going to show you some evidence for these things as well. So this is the main result for the willingness to take risks. I've shown you before the world pattern. This is now a pattern that we obtained from German data, from the German socioeconomic panel, which allows us, in contrast to the world data that was only elicited once in a cross-section. Here in the German data, we have repeated observations for the same individuals, and we can actually do this cohort, period, and age decomposition. And now I'm showing you the cleaned age profile for risk preference, for the willingness to take risk. And you see, again, there is a downward sloping willingness to take risk profile over age ranges. If I widen the age ranges, you might even argue that, well, willingness to take risk is going down, but it eventually, in the 60s, 70s, the willingness to take risk stabilizes. Unfortunately, I cannot show you that for patients because I don't have the data. They were not elicited in the socioeconomic panel, but and the same goes for social preferences. But I can show you similar profiles for other personality traits that are important and that have been studied, particularly by psychologists. For instance, the big five, the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism measures, or political preferences. And if you do this decomposition, this is what you get. Maybe this is something that one would have expected, but openness seems to decline. Well, there is a plateau in middle ages, but at old ages, people get less and less open to new experiences, but they're getting more conscientious. And again, these are age profiles that account for cohort and period differences. So they are cleaned for cohort and period influences. Extroversion seems to go down and agreeableness seems to go up. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that people change. They change psychologically, but they also change in terms of their economically relevant preferences, as I showed you in the context of risk attitudes or risk preferences. But then you might still not be able to believe that this is a truly an age effect. Yeah? And because the question could be, what is it? Is it biology? Is it really metabolical changes in the body? Is it hormonal changes? Is it experiences? Because if I take serious what I just said, these age profiles, they only leave as a potential explanation for age effects, for variation in preferences according to age, individual level things that are varying within cohorts and within time periods. That could be individual experiences, as I said before, car accidents, severe diseases, and so on. But what I want to get at is one other aspect. Maybe it's not retrospective age that matters. Maybe it is prospective age. Maybe it is not how long people have lived since their birth, but maybe it is how long they expect to live in the future that affects their preferences. And when you talk about patients, that is, of course, very obvious. If I ask you the question, are you willing to wait 1 year for $150 instead of $100, but you don't expect to live in 1 year because you're severely ill, I'm going to elicit a much more impatiently looking behavior than if I asked it to a person at age 20 that expects to live at least for 60 more years. So for patients, this prospective age pattern is potentially very important. For risk preferences, it might be also important, but it's much less clear what would be the directed hypothesis of that, and the same for political preferences and other preferences. So how would I go along in terms of decomposing retrospective age, chronological age, from prospective age? Well, the thing that you could do is you could decompose age by saying, well, from an individual point of view, how long they have lived is as good as exogenous, accounting for, say, maybe minor selection issues. But it might also be exogenous how long they have to live, at least once I start comparing individuals across populations that are facing different life expectancies. And this is exactly what we did in our research in order to identify or to decompose chronological from prospective age patterns. Now, again, if you go back to this global preference data, what we observe is individuals in different age gender cells across different countries. And if you think about the differences that we can then exploit in terms of life tables, we know that 40-year-old German males face a different life expectancy than 40-year-old American males. And there is also variation across genders, because the 40-year-old German women might face different life expectancies than the 40-year-old US American women. And this allows us to construct a statistical decomposition that allows us to decompose plain age effects from these remaining life year effects. Now, this is a plot that, as again, we have from the Global Preference Survey, where we plot life expectancy at birth against patients in terms of country averages. And what you see is that, well, people in countries, so we've added, we've taken out some obvious correlates like income, for instance, so income per capita. But what you see is that there's a positive correlation between life expectancy at birth and patients. The problem is that this picture would not be sufficient to decompose age from patients, mainly because I don't even account for the age differences in these countries. And these countries differ a lot in terms of the age composition of their population. But I have the possibility to go to the individual level data, and I can now start decomposing at the individual level for individuals of the same age and gender group across countries, what is the effect of remaining life expectancy. If I do that, this is the picture that I get, a significantly positive correlation. So indeed, people that expect to live longer in our survey experiments, they behave more patiently. They make more patient responses to questions like, are you willing to wait for higher payments for 1 year or in the future? And this is a very robust finding. So this is one of the two only tables that I'm going to show you. These are regression results where the dependent variable is patience. So we try to explain the level of patience that we elicited at the level of almost 80,000 individuals. And we, as explanatory variable, use remaining years of life. And the positive coefficient of 1.63 means, well, adding remaining years of life, holding fixed gender, holding fixed country influences, age, and other things, is associated with higher levels of patience. And the different columns show you that that is a robust finding once we start adding additional controls, such as individual education, individual income, individual demographic status, like are they married or not, and so on. We can even go to extremely demanding specifications that take out a lot of variation. The effect of remaining life years on patients is surprisingly robust. What happens to the previous results that I showed you? And the previous results were the age profile. So on the left panel of this figure, I show you the age profile that we would have looked at before, having in mind retrospective age. The right figure is the same age profile, but now I'm taking out life expectancy. And you see, well, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. You might say it's very similar, but what you see is that there are some differences. For instance, the plain age profile seems to be decreasing and concave, whereas the conditional age profile seems to exhibit increasing patience until around the 50s. And only afterwards is patience decreasing. But this decrease in patience now is a true age effect, because we've taken out remaining life years. So we've taken out the plain, in this figure, confounding effect of prospective age, which I've shown you here. Does that hold for other preferences? Not so much. If we compare the results for the same regressions, but with different outcome variables for risk aversion or willingness to take risk, altruism, social preferences, trust, positive and negative reciprocity, we find no connection. The only one, or no association, the only one that we find is for positive reciprocity, which is a social preference construct that effectively says, well, if people are nice to you, are you willing to incur costs to reciprocate these favors, even if they're costly to you? So if you might be a bit more loose, also positive reciprocity has an intertemporal component here, which might rationalize. But the effect is weaker than what we saw for patients. Let me end with other preferences. So does that same decomposition also hold for other preferences? And one of the studies that I did with a previous postdoc of mine was on the preference for democracy. Why did we study that? Well, because a lot of the political science debate on democracy and democratization has been played on intertemporal choices. Yeah. So if you want to change political institutions, are you willing to incur costs now for future benefits? And if you do that, and what we did here was just use data from the World Value Survey, the identification strategy is very similar to what we've just seen, and you decompose age from remaining life years effects, what you see is that there are also different patterns. So apparently the preferences for democracy increase with age once you hold life expectancy constant, but the closer people get to death, so the smaller the remaining life years are, the less they care for democracy, which might, of course, be an issue to be kept in mind in countries that differ a lot in terms of their demographic background. When we talk about, I don't know, democratization in Africa or in Latin America, these are issues that political scientists have largely ignored. And if democratization is something that is related to individual preferences, there is a link between demography and institutional preferences that also appears. let me wrap up here. So what I've shown you is that age is correlated with preferences, and preferences in the context of economic preferences, time preferences, risk preferences. They're associated at the individual and at the aggregate level. It also relates to social preferences. But I've also shown you some novel evidence about the channels that point towards age effects that might reflect experiences and environmental conditions that people experience during their lives. But it also might relate to prospective age. And here I showed you some heterogeneity with respect to the type of preference that we look at. What might be other drivers of that? So interesting, but I think largely unresolved questions in these contexts are still, so what might be behind this life expectancy, behind this longevity thing? One thing might be the subjective perception of how long people have to live. What I've just shown you was a statistical analysis of life expectancy for particular age gender cells, where I could take life expectancy as plausibly exogenous from the individual perspective. But of course, individuals of the same age and gender in a particular country might differ vastly in terms of the life expectancy that they subjectively perceive. The age patterns might also be related to cognition, and as soon as we go for cognition, we enter a very, very difficult area and difficult field in terms of even methodologically, what are we talking about when we elicit these preferences? So I can talk maybe about that later on. But I think these findings have important implications, because if preferences are responsible for individual decisions, purchasing decisions, investment decisions, education decisions, then these decisions might change over the life cycle, partly because the underlying preferences are changing and we're just beginning to understand these preference processes. And this, of course, also leads to implications at the aggregate level. Yeah? So aging populations might exhibit different aggregate preferences for redistribution, for institutions. They might exhibit different investment decisions, even different portfolio choices, and so on. So I think there is a lot to be learned by looking closer at age, longevity, and preferences connections. And I hope I gave you some insights on what we've already found out, but also on the current research agenda. Thanks a lot. Let me end here, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Great presentation again. And I have a huge number of questions, and it's a very, I must say, difficult topic to really disentangle all the aspects. But let me start with the one slide you showed where you adjusted for the lifespan, where you showed that the patient is only decreasing at the age of 50 onwards. So there was a plateau and then it was decreasing. So what is behind that? Is that, for example, physical function? Is that the accumulation of age-related diseases? What is happening at that point? It seems to be a turning point at the age of 50. Do you have any explanation?
I only have conjectures, unfortunately. So as I said, so this is this finding was only possible because we elicited these data across countries, and now we are happy to have an age pattern that is there. But looking at what is behind, that is still on the agenda. My hunch is that it will be a mix between physiological aspects and maybe cognitive aspects, because people that age might have more and more difficulties, thinking about the future and engaging in long-run considerations. But I don't know. So I think there is a lot to be learned still in the future.
Yeah, so it might be nice to look at data of cognitive function of that population where you have the data from to see where associations can be found. For example, in muscle characteristics, we also see that turning point at the age of 45 to 50, where there's a steeper decline in function.
Exactly, but methodologically, what we would like to have would be measures for the individuals themselves, because we might get to statistical artifacts if we look at country level or profile level variation only. But
Yes.
I agree. I mean, it's fascinating. I just can't say more on that because it's still on the agenda.
Yeah, I would really like to know what your thinking is about a possible genetic contribution to certain traits of time and risk preference. The first question would be, does a certain preference run in families?
Yes, so we have evidence. There has been a debate, and I've contributed to that a while ago, whether it's nature or nurture. So whether these preferences are transmitted from parents to children. We have evidence that they are. There are also environmental effects, but there's a very strong transmission from parents to children. Part of it seems to be genetic, part of it seems to be behavioral. And there's an ongoing debate, how big are these parts? So I would personally, my hunch is 50-50, but we were happy to see that it's not only genetics, but also behavioral, but there is definitely a genetic component.
But are there any data sets where you actually have the genome of these individuals and you could see?
You do it indirectly. You do it indirectly by looking either at parents and children or at siblings. And you then do these usual decompositions that you do when.
But of course, then you do not know if it's just running in the families because it's of the genetic trait, or it's behavior you are getting because you are living in the same family and you have the same behavior.
But that's what I said. So when you have siblings, you can do that because you might have genetic siblings, but you might also live in the same households, but they are not genetically related or to a lesser degree.
Yeah.
So there are studies like that that do exactly this type of analysis. Yeah. Or do you have duozygotic or monozygotic twins? So you can do with that. But of course, if the question was which type of SNPs are relevant, that is very hard.
Yeah. I have another question about the physiology. Maybe you said that younger people take more risk. They have more time left on Earth. They might know that they are more resilient. So if something is happening and by taking the risk, then they are still resilient. They have flexibility. Do we know anything in animal models actually showing the same? So do animals take more risk while hunting, for example, when being younger? Have you ever thought about thinking about animal models in your risk-taking and time preference models?
I must confess I haven't, but that's a very interesting consideration. I don't know. But let me add one thing to what you just said. That is exactly right. It's one conjecture. Another conjecture could be, look, if you're young and you're very, very risk-taking, when I was young, I was a climber, which is allegedly very, very risky. You risk, you risk your life, so your opportunity costs of the lottery going wrong is huge. So you might say, well, it's not quite clear. Young people might actually be less willing to take certain risks because they lose much more if things go wrong.
I was also very impressed by the openness question. So how open are you? And it is lower with higher age, if I remember correctly, but there was also a little bit more variation. So that variation, of course, in longevity is very interesting because it might be very meaningful. So do you know if at this certain age, chronological age, if somebody is more open, that is also associated with a better outcome? Do you have these kind of association studies?
Yes, there is a literature on the role of personality traits on economic outcomes. These personality traits, I should add, they are elicited as part of a standard toolbox that is being used by psychologists. So this is a number of questions, and then they are aggregated towards one measure of openness, which is then standardized. So this is what we also used here. And there is a literature. Jim Heckman at Chicago has worked a lot on that, and Angela Duckworth. So
tell me, should you be more open or less?
Oh, well, that I don't know. But I think openness to experience is something that is associated with positive outcomes in the long run. Yeah, because people take opportunities in a different way. there is also some studies that have tried to understand whether it's just another way of saying they're more willing to take risks. And it seems that these personality traits are actually distinct from these economic preferences that I've shown you.
Okay. And is there also an association with being nice? Because you also had that little hint of, if you are nice, you will get a return of investment sometimes.
I think that is more agreeableness.
Okay, let's switch a little bit the topic. I really like your remarks about the life events. And in medical practice, of course, we see lots of individuals with life events, and very often at that point in time, people change their behavior, stop smoking, lose weight, etc. Or there's also a sort of trade of individuals and tribe really changing in the maybe wrong direction. So how do people change in terms of, when you're looking at time and risk preference, if there is a life event, and does that life event matter, because you have positive and negative ones?
So the literature that I know actually has looked at things like car accidents or severe diseases, and that makes people more risk averse. That is what I recall. Now, but we must understand that this is, of course, individual level variability that is above and beyond these overall age patterns and longevity patterns that I showed you. And well, of course, I don't explain all of it with these age patterns. I explain a fraction of the variation, and these life events are a huge other fraction of variation that you see there, which in the statistical analysis that I've shown you, we basically filter out. But I agree, these are very, very important drivers and determinants of preferences.
I see that Stephen Rach is here and handling the Q&A section, and I see lots of questions of the audience, which is great. I had a question about the democracy part, but I think we shouldn't touch on the political side here. I think it's worrying seeing an aging population. But Stephen, what are the other questions?
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk. It's a really interesting talk. So I think there are quite a number of questions. So just let me go through some of them. So I think there are a couple of questions on this aspect of patience. So what role does patience have in affecting how a country's economy may grow faster than another? And kind of related to that is, wouldn't those who are more affluent score higher for patience, because one's ability to delay gratification might be influenced by whether one is in urgent need or in a state of lack?
Yeah, that's one of the hard questions, the key questions and hard questions for economists. In the data, it's very clear. In the data, what you see is that more patient people, they do all sorts of things that are beneficial for their economic well-being. They invest more, they save more and invest more. They are more educated, they have higher incomes. If you aggregate up in countries where the populations are more patient, savings are higher, education is higher, incomes per capita is higher, research and development is higher. We actually have just published a paper recently in which we show that the problem is always to disentangle, as you said, cause and consequence. Is it that people are more patient because they're richer, or are they richer because they're more patient? Now, in this study that I was mentioning, what we look at is a model that is, very plain vanilla economic, where you have investment decisions and preferences are the primitives. And we try to understand, can a model like that help us understand why across countries these effects of patience differences are much, much bigger than at the individual level. And in the model, what we try to uncover, and I think we do that quite successfully also with data, is, well, if we live in a society that is more patient, you invest more, I invest more, but I see you investing more, and that might help my investment returns. So I think if it gets to a hard question, cause and consequence, I would always go for, yes, patience is the cause and economic outcomes are the consequence. Of course, there might be feedback effects, and of course there are long-run development and evolutionary dynamics, but in the short-run cross-section, I would go for that direction.
There's another question on the translational aspect of your work. So how can a clinician work this into interactions with their patients? Is it possible, and is there any model of it?
Well, if dealing with patients means dealing with people that you don't see, but they have to take their medication while you don't observe them, and maybe taking medication is like a thing that resembles an intertemporal choice, because they have to do it now in order to get healthier sooner and so on. I think there is a direct link. But the link could be that maybe it's important to understand which patients are patient and which patients are impatient, and it's the impatient ones that need maybe more more supervision or more help.
Yeah.
I maybe one other thing. What I've talked about is patience. There is a lot of research on behavioral economics about time inconsistencies that is basically an additional complication, but people seem to be also a lot of time inconsistent in the sense that later is really a completely different thing than now. Above and beyond patience, there might be a present bias, so to speak, that what they do now, and whatever is in the future, they discount too much, and that makes people become addicted. That makes people not to do what they should do, what is beneficial for them. But again, there are measures that can allow you to elicit these type of behaviors.
Okay, thank you. There's a couple of questions related to wealth, so I'll just lump them together. So one of it is, what were some of the practical implications of your findings towards economic development for poorer countries? And also related to that is, how does lifespan expectancy affect demographic transition into generating positive income?
So the first question is actually what brought me here. So as Andrea said at the beginning, I started out as a growth economist, and I always try to understand what is the key mechanism that makes a country do the transition from stagnation to growth. And unlike a lot of the literature, what we started focusing on with my co-author Matteo Cervellati was life expectancy as a key determinant of education decisions. And I think all the evidence that I showed you is consistent with exactly that. So in order to invest into the future, you need to be patient. But what do you need to be patient? Well, conditional on genetic predispositions and your family and so on, maybe the fact that longevity matters is key. So in developing countries, maybe health interventions are exactly what is needed to make people appreciate that they live long, so it's worth investing rather than just going on like it is. And a similar but more difficult relation holds for institutional change as well. I think if you expect that you're going to die very soon, why should you care about changing institutions one way or the other?
What are some of your future directions towards understanding the role of life expectancy on the economic development of countries?
So currently what we're working on is a field that I have not really touched much upon, which is international spillovers. So what is the role of health transfers? What is the role of technology transfers, and how can they complement each other? Because in these long-run models that I was mentioning, life expectancy is somehow given, but where does it come from? I mean, the medical innovation happens in the developed world, and you see that, for instance, the epidemiological transition and not only the invention of drugs, antibiotics, and all sorts of vaccines is important, but also the dissemination, and this is like one of the major black spots, I would say, in the research still. How important are these international spillovers? What makes countries able to actually grab medical innovations from the world medical frontier? What can international institutions do to help with that, and so on? And on the micro side, I think there's still a lot to be done. I mean, we discussed many questions on the individual level, behavioral side. We're just starting to understand a bit better what are the relations between aging, lifespan, preferences, and behavioral aspects. So that is an ongoing research agenda that I think I'm going to follow up.
Another question is, what are some of the major factors that can positively influence behavioral economics in a population that is now aging longer?
Oh, that's a tough question, because behavioral economics typically, as far as maybe behavioral economists would disagree, but being an economist, you typically use what I said: preferences, information, budget constraints, and then you try to understand what people's behavior should be, and then you compare it to what it actually is, and then you derive what people have termed behavioral biases. I mentioned time inconsistent choices, for instance. This is something that a standard economic model would not deliver, but we see that people are behaving this way. So in that sense, there's more need to understand that. And a lot of recent work has focused on things like nudging to help people overcome these type of time inconsistencies, which are particularly relevant, I would say, also in the medical context. The thing about preferences, I think, goes a bit deeper, because it's not just a bias that you can correct by changing the default or do things like that. I think it is something that we have to understand better in terms of how it shapes long-run behavior. But it's of course complementary. So and honestly, I don't think that a lot of work has been done in characterizing the generality of behavioral biases, time inconsistency, and so on across the lifespan or for different age groups. So I think this is also something that we need to understand better.
Thank you. Maybe we can just close with one last question. This is quite an interesting one, because we know that multiple factors actually affect behavior. So there's this question about, has the effect of toxoplasmosis on risk-taking behavior been explored in your studies? And it has been recently reported that this in wolves makes them more likely to be pack leaders.
Oh, wow. This is a question that I have difficulties responding, because I don't even know the evidence. I don't even know what toxoplasmosis.
That was an interesting question, yeah.
But I would be interested in learning about it. So whoever made that question, maybe send me an email and I'll read more up into that.
Okay. It's an infection. So I think, again, how do life events, how do changes in physical states make you to act differently in terms of time and risk preferences? Thank you so much. It was such an enjoyable hour with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. It was great.
Of course, thank you for listening today. Your feedback is highly valuable, so please use the chat function to leave us messages. If you are looking for new opportunities and you want to join our team, check out the various career opportunities. We have them, yes, in the link provided in the chat box, or you can find them also on our website. If you missed a couple of previous webinars, that's not an issue, because they're all recorded and you can find them on our YouTube channel. Just Google. And very important, we are approaching the end of the year, and you have to re-register for the webinars, and we will make it easy for you, no problem. We are sending you an email next week with a link, and then you just have to re-register for the entire year. It is also time to thank our sponsors for this webinar series. It's Leo Drago and Antonia Hui. Because of them, we are really able to making this webinar a success. So thank you so much. The next webinar is on the 8th of December, 2022, this year, and it is Professor Richard Miller being hosted by Professor Brian Kennedy. I'm closing today with a webinar. I saw it and I had a little bit of tears, because it showed a fantastic human interaction. So I hope you enjoy it. Take care and be nice.
I don't know how to draw you.
Beg your pardon?
I said I don't know how to draw boys.
I'm a boy.
Yeah, but I don't know how to draw boys. I don't know how to draw boys. I don't know how to draw boys.
You're all right.
And I don't know how
Don't
to draw
cry.
boys.
Don't cry, love. You're right. You're nice.
I don't know how to draw boys.
I don't want you to cry. My friend Leica, she uses me as a bit of a security blanket when she gets a bit lost and wants to calm down. I'll get you a tissue and we'll wipe all the tears away.
At this age, children get a lot of their confidence from their relationships with important adults who give us that unconditional regard.
I didn't think you looked so awful.
Don't say that.
It's just your thing. It looks funny. Look, it doesn't look beautiful or something like that. It looks funny.
When we have an adult who always accepts the child, it doesn't matter if you're sad, I still adore you. I'm not going to reject you. It tells you that as a child, I'm allowed to make mistakes and still be loved. You know, having somebody who never gives up on you sets you free.
I love those eyes of yours, John. What do you reckon?
Well,
Are you happy with the resemblance?
I think it's, if I look that good, well, I'm happy. I'm happy.
I'm feeling like sunshine, like springtime, like something's in the water and I'm taking a deep dive. I'm feeling so weightless, like I'm gonna make it, and nothing in the universe can take this. I can see it clearly now, nothing gonna bring me down.